Good morning. I'm Stephen Kenny. I'm the director of the Strategic Foresight Initiative here at the Middle East Institute, and also the founder and principal of the strategy consultancy Foresight Vector. And I'm delighted to welcome all of you to our webinar today on alternative futures in the Black Sea region. The Strategic Foresight Initiative is a relatively new program here at MEI, devoted to examining drivers of change and the spectrum of scenario possibilities in the Middle East region and challenging conventional thinking about the future to help leaders chart their courses forward in creative new ways. Anybody who's joining us for this session today recognizes the growing and future strategic importance of the Black Sea region. MEI's Frontier Europe initiative program was created to really scale and broaden that recognition, and in doing so to increase the investment of attention and time that leaders around the world are making in developing strategies that increase security and economic and social development in the region. Our topic today is the futures of the Black Sea region, and I say futures in the plural very deliberately. The Frontier Europe initiative and the Foresight program recently teamed up and developed a set of 4 alternative scenarios set out about a decade in the future. We explored dynamics of defense and security, infrastructure development, economies and trade, societal cohesion, and a range of other factors and how they might interact and play out in the years ahead. A report with our scenarios and analysis is available on MEI's website, and our communications team will also be dropping a link to that report into the chat here on our webinar today. Our aim in this project is to help inform the development of a US strategy for the Black Sea region, an aim that I think is particularly important today as the new Biden administration is beginning to chart its course in this part of the world as it's doing in other geographic and policy areas. We chose the approach that we took in this work because scenarios provide an important value in strategy making in a variety of ways. They enable leaders to see and really kind of experience the impacts of different policy and other choices that they might make and how they could impact the future in different ways. They shed light on the underlying dynamics of change in leaders' areas of responsibility and areas of interest. They enable us to really consider possibilities that we wouldn't, or in some cases couldn't otherwise imagine, and the implications of those possibilities. And maybe most importantly, they compel us to challenge our assumptions about the future and to confront the possibility that some of those assumptions might be outdated or even flawed. So to talk about Black Sea futures today, we have 3 individuals with us whose understanding and experience of this region of the world is really difficult to overestimate. First, it's my honor to introduce General Retired Philip Breedlove. General Breedlove served as the US and NATO Supreme Allied Commander Europe, a role in which his area of responsibility included this part of the world. General Breedlove now wears many hats, not least of which is as the distinguished chair of MEI's Frontier Europe Initiative program, and also distinguished professor of the Sam Nunn International Affairs School at Georgia Tech University. Next, we have Giselle Donnelly. Giselle is a highly and widely regarded scholar of international affairs and geopolitics. She currently serves as a senior resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where she focuses on issues of defense, programs, operations, and budgets globally. Finally, I'd like to introduce Yulia Zhozha. Yulia is a senior fellow at MEI's Frontier Europe Initiative, as well as an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. Her teaching and research focuses on European and Black Sea security, and she has served as an advisor to the President of Romania, to NATO, and to the European Parliament. Julia, Giselle, General, thank you all very much for being here today. For those in our audience, if you'd like to submit questions, please use the Zoom Q&A function, which is down at the bottom of your screen toward the right. If you're joining by phone or watching on the live stream, and you'd like to pose a question, you can email that into events@mei.edu. Anybody experiencing any technical issues can use that same email address, events@mei.edu. And please feel free to pose questions at any time during the program. I'll be watching them as they come in, and I will try to pose as many of them as our time allows to the panelists to make them part of our discussion. Our approach will be not to ask any of our panelists to comment on the specific individual scenarios. Instead, what I'll do is raise some of the interesting and provocative, in some cases counterintuitive ideas that emerged in our work, and ask Yulia and Giselle and General Breedlove to comment on what they see as some of the potential implications if we were to see some of these things emerge in the region in the years to come. So let's jump in. Yulia, let me start with you. Since the end of the Cold War, setting Russia aside, of course, the nations of the Black Sea region have prioritized the West as their security and strategic partners. As you know, in some of our scenarios, these nations are equally open to strategic and security relationships with China, Russia, and other non-Western partners. What are some of the factors that could lead to something like that? And if we were to see that, what do you think some of the implications might be?
Thank you, Stephen, for your question, and thank you for putting together this fantastic report that General Breedlove and I and many others have spent painful hours on workshops saying all the time, this doesn't work, but in the end we made it work, I think. And I think the scenarios for those of our participants who haven't read them are very interesting and multifaceted in that they do not show a clear worst case scenario or best case scenario, but are trying to balance drivers and how they influence that. And in terms of your question, Stephen, with the West and other players increasingly in the region, what I've seen over the last few decades is that especially the specificity of the Black Sea is that we have no political unique unified threat assessment of Russia or other threats. So if you look at the Black Sea countries, it's a combination of countries that part of them are NATO members, part of them are NATO aspirants. And interestingly enough, the aspirants are often more bought into a strategic alliance with the United States than some of the members at the moment. So with this complicated geographical and political setting, of course, over the last few years, with Russia's increasingly aggressive actions, 2008, and then after 2014, more aggressive, we've seen countries forced to position themselves in between and to make it more complicated. China is coming into the region as well as part of the package of Central Eastern European countries and New Silk Road, BRI, all these initiatives. So for many of the countries at the moment, what we've seen in looking into the future is that in the Black Sea, many rely on the United States as an ultimate security guarantee, however fickle that may be based on NATO membership or not, even if you are a NATO member, on the United States. But that reliance is not backed, and maybe that's something we can draw upon in the conversation today, is not backed by the rest. We've seen, as we're looking at the evolution of the Black Sea over the last few years, an increasingly and to be applauded Western US presence. Over the last couple of years or so, especially after Brexit, we've seen an slight increasing of the UK, but there is on the other side an absence of other Western players in the Black Sea region, say France, say Germany, say Poland to a certain extent. And with this complicated geopolitical position, in the context of the pandemic, and as we're looking in our scenarios beyond in the past pandemic world, we already see that countries often in the region who would prefer to go with the West have no options, or oftentimes do not have immediate options to go with the West. Look at Ukraine, that is kind of the hot spot now. I think General Breedlove will talk more about what is on the ground, and perhaps Giselle too. But Ukraine is now in a situation in which it cannot ensure vaccines from the West, whether the EU or the United States. It says no to Russia, of course, based on geopolitical obviousness. And so it is left with the China approach. And then we're waiting. This is kind of the dynamic that we're seeing and we're projecting into the future, that the United States, based on pressure from the Black Sea, needs to step in, but it can only step in to a certain extent. Resources are limited. So the vacuum that is created is filled oftentimes, or attempted to be filled, by Russia and China, whether it is COVID or it is industry, critical infrastructure, energy wars, etc. And these countries in the middle, whether we talk about strongholds of Western promotion of security in Romania, or a complete ambiguity in Turkey, these countries are trying to find their own way. And what I think we're trying to show with this report and the scenarios, that in the past pandemic world, they will have to be somewhere in the middle as well, preferring the United States in many cases, not all of the Black Sea countries, but having to deal with national security emergencies that can lead them on the eastern path, whatever that may be.
Terrific, Julia, thank you. Giselle or General, anything you'd like to add to that, or counterpoint to what Julia was talking about?
No, there was a brilliant tour of the horizon. She mentioned the fickleness of the United States in passing, and I mean, I would like to praise the report and the scenarios. I promise to only do it once, but it is actually just the kind of thinking that such an uncertain region begs for. So well done to all, and I commend it to all who are watching. But it does sort of remind us that for the past generation, perhaps a great geopolitical opportunity has gone begging. The region still remains kind of a no man's land, and actually there are sort of more wolves circling, if I can mix my metaphors, than there were some years ago. And one, I suppose, could be hopeful that the United States will now continue the slight initiative that it's taken in the region, but still the overall impression that I am left with very much is that several decades of Western-leaning opportunity and potential for strategic stability and partnerships have been, if not squandered, then very close to it. And I worry that the window of opportunity is closing. And I do think the Ukrainians' dilemma when it comes to vaccines is a great indicator of, that's not the same thing as actual military forces or other stronger forms of power, but perhaps it's indicative of what might lie in the future for the region. And to me, that's not a very happy prospect.
Thanks, Giselle. General, let me ask you, it's kind of building a little bit on some of what we've heard already from Julia and Giselle, about the clarity of the commitments and the fickleness, as you both pointed out. The NATO alliance and the European Union obviously are two institutions that are intended in many ways to strengthen the integration of member countries to the West. One of the ideas, as you know, that we explored in the scenarios as well, has to do with the membership in NATO and the EU, and the idea of what has been described in the EU context, at least, as a multi-tier approach, meaning different statuses for different nations and different obligations for different nations. If we were to see that type of model in either or both of those organizations, what might that look like, and what would be some of the implications, particularly for security in the region?
So let me first just, again, compliment the work that was done on the report. I think it's really good and commend it for all to read. Let me violently agree with my two compatriots here in their remarks. And I would like to jump on something that Giselle said right at the end. And you all know me as I try to remain apolitical, so I'm not trying to point to any individual. But may I just say, for the past decade to 15 years, Western leadership in this part of the world has been diminishing, in my opinion. And frankly, US leadership in this part of the world has been diminishing. And now we find ourselves trying to reset the stage a little bit. I often point to when we saw the Russians go into the Donbass and set up the proxy forces and use their forces to set the enclave in the current line of contact. You know, in the United States, we really just sort of washed our hands and said, over to you, Miss Merkel, over to you, Mr. Hollande. And this is a European thing, and you all use the Normandy format and try to work through this. And I think that sends a clear message. Yulia very pleasantly used the fickle word, but you know, I would have used maybe a different word. But we set expectations by our actions, and really we step back from the table, I think, in a leadership position. And I really do believe it's time for the West, and specifically for the United States, to reassert and become a part of the dialogue that could possibly still correct problems that we have out there. And they're more than the Donbass, and we still have South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And there's just a lot of things that need to be worked out yet. And I think we need to be at the table, we, the United States, and I think the West writ large, no matter the institution, needs to be at the table here to move this along. As far as the multi-tier approach in NATO and EU, I've been thinking about this a little bit, and I actually believe we sort of already have that. I think I know what you're reaching for, but you know, we have partners and we have non-partners and we have levels of partners, etc. And the words don't seem to mean a lot anymore, but what does mean something is the level of engagement that we have with these countries. The level of engagement with Georgia in the defense sector is very high. We've been training with them. I brag on Georgia all the time. They gave more soldiers per capita than any country, to include the United States, when it came to Afghanistan, and they lost more soldiers than any country, to include the United States, in a per capita way. And they served without caveat anywhere we asked them to go. And that was because of a relationship that we've established with Georgia, the training of our Marines, our US Army, and even our US Air Force to some degree with those forces, and the engagement that we've had with the government to try to bring it more in line with what the West, the EU, and NATO need. So I think that I would love to see this to continue to step up and ramp up for the right countries that are showing the right movements. And I put Georgia in that, I put Ukraine in that. Step up the levels of engagement, the levels of training, establishing interoperability. I believe that's the way to go. And if there's a magic sauce, if you'll allow me to use a silly metaphor, if there's a magic sauce, we need to find that which will make these countries more acceptable to the old Europe that is really not interested in bringing them into NATO if there are Russians sitting in their territory. We need to find that movement that makes a situation that is more acceptable to bring them along. I'd be more my more learned panelists can do it for me.
I see head nods there from you, Giselle and Julia. Giselle, you want to expand on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, the generals couldn't be more right about the Georgians, for example. I mean, they were in Iraq, for crying out loud. I mean, much of NATO was in Afghanistan, and many of our NATO partners fought bravely and well in Afghanistan. But the Georgians' participation in Iraq, to me, was an expression of that, not just a Georgian feeling, but an expression of the desire to be part of the American-led West and the willingness to, put lives on the line for something that was hardly a compelling strategic interest for proximate threat to the Georgians. And then the tragedy was that we looked the other way in 2008. So that message is of our behavior is a seriously powerful one that we still, I think, I'm going to defer to others, but I worry that that's a black mark that will take a long time to erase, and it has an effect on the way others in the region regard us. They would love us to be the United States that they grew up envying and loving and aspiring to be. And finally, look, this is a region where security is an open question. Okay, I mean, we and the Western Europeans have kind of moved on to more first world type problems, if I can use that phrase. But hard power is the coin of the realm out there, and these are states that are at risk. And we also tend to put the cart before the horse too much, or not be able to balance it. I mean, General Breedlove mentioned the multi-tier system. And to me, that's also, any engagement is better than no engagement. But to the degree that this becomes an excuse for people to not take the hard security steps that are really, again, it's the coin of the realm across the region, coin of the realm for states that feel themselves quite rightly to be under threat, sometimes both internally as well as externally. So, I hate to sound like the Cassandra at the party, but again, I think we have to go a long way, and I'm concerned that this administration particularly will think that normal diplomacy, or the restoration of normal diplomacy, will meet the challenge. And I question whether that's so.
Thanks, Giselle. And you used a phrase a moment ago, hard power is the coin of the realm here in this region, which is certainly true. And confronting that has not been straightforward when we've seen it. What we're also seeing, and what we did some thinking and speculating about in our scenario analysis, also was the prospect of Russia doubling down on what analysts, in the real world today call hybrid or gray zone warfare. And this is to any of you. I'll start with you, Giselle, but I know, General, this was part of your bread and butter when you were serving in the role in Europe. What are some of the ways that the nations of the region can prepare for and contend with those kinds of contingencies if we do see them increasing from Russia in the future?
Well, I mean, particularly in regions like this, where there is an absence of really first-class forces, and I would actually include the Russians and not in that first tier. So you see the Ukrainians, for example, buying drones like as fast as they can from the Turks, for example. The Turks have convinced themselves that they've discovered a hugely effective new way of warfare, and it may be work itself out in Libya and Syria and Armenia and stuff like that. But if it's the only power being used, then it can be proven to be quite effective. But I also, think that there is going to be a kind of faddish moment for quite some time to move in this direction, to use political warfare and these methods that have sort of been pioneered, again, in the absence of American forces in particular, but really, highly capable forces in the region. So when highly capable forces are absent, these forms of politico-military warfare can be hugely effective and make a real difference. And again, it combined with the general uncertainty of the region, the uncertainty about the guarantees from the West and the United States in particular, it seems like there are a lot of people with the ability to get themselves into trouble, but not to do any, and not to be able to get out of it, so to speak. And that predilection or the attraction of gray zone warfare, or whatever term you want to call it by, I expect to continue to rise, because it's something within the grasp of the nations of the region, and in the right circumstances, that's proven to be very effective. I'll stop here, but you have to wonder exactly what the Turks are taking away from this recent experience, whether they've decided this is the way to work out their neo-Ottoman destiny, or just what. I mean, they do seem to be riding high.
Yulia or General Breedlove, I mean, what are there unconventional ways of thinking about how to contend with this unconventional threat that Russia clearly poses and others pose in the region today and in the future?
Yulia, jump in there and I'll clean up.
All right. Well, I wanted to take a bit of a different approach, though I'm a security gal, and I'd love to talk about weapons and new warfare. The other thing that I wanted to, and I think is interesting, we had already some questions trickling in from the audience on that, is in terms of, if you want to call it societal resilience, democratic resilience. We've seen all over the world, in the Western world and now in the Black Sea, increasingly political crises, whether we refer to the COVID example, the vaccines in Ukraine, political crises in Georgia at the moment, in Bulgaria for many months. All of that in combination with studies not being published yet on disinformation, what I see from the region is that there is an increasing lack of democratic resilience, where Russia and China increasingly are hitting hard in that hybrid warfare with inexpensive instruments and destroying unity and trust and solidarity. The example that I always love to give from the defense realm is the ballistic missile defense in Romania and how that's being perceived. Now, when you Google the words in Romanian ballistic missile defense, you have 2 pages of results these are statements from the Kremlin saying this is a threat to Romanian national security, which changes the perception of people from a source of security, how it was initially perceived, to a source of insecurity because it makes Romania or others vulnerable to threats, continuous threats, existential threats to a certain extent, but it affects the security perception of the population. And you have that with fickleness, what we all refer to from the West, and a lack of buy-in from other Western powers. We do see a reaction to that in terms of what we've looked at in these scenarios, the driver of societal homogeneity or heterogeneity, that in my view is on the decline, and we'll see with the aid of Russians and Chinese more of that decline. And that, of course, doesn't help the United States neither, right? Because we have a Biden administration that is pushing for a global democracy summit, and it's unclear where this region fits in, and where some of these countries fit in. Are they a gray zone of democracy as well? And to what extent is the United States willing to balance in a region, as Giselle and General Breedlove several times underlined, where hard security and hard security concerns remain the main security concerns, right? You cannot have prosperity or democratic resilience without hard security. And with the conundrum that we're dealing with these scenarios, the dilemma of building Western critical infrastructure that can lead to more security and guarantees, but can also, in a paradoxical effect, lead to destruction from enemy forces, right? And so you see all these regions that are specific to the Black Sea frozen conflicts, active conflicts, where infrastructure has been completely destroyed. They have been capped off from all these regional areas, have been capped off from health security, from military security, Western security, from societal security over the last few years, or many years in the case of Georgia. And we see that increasingly moving in. So with Turkey playing this complex game of neo-Ottomanism, but with an unclear policy on the Black Sea, with the rest of the Black Sea having to rely on Turkey, whether we like it or not, because it holds the keys through the Montreux Convention for now, and its policy has been keeping the West out, externals out, and that means the West. These dynamics, in my opinion, are becoming more complicated also in terms of perception. So all that underdevelopment that is specific to the region in terms of economic infrastructure, all these things that needs to be lifted with Western investments, with cooperation transnationally in the region. We see that increasingly, but with insufficient small signs, with a lack in technology that I think Giselle was referring to in military terms, but also in civilian terms. This region becomes even more vulnerable to all these things. So maybe just as a last note on discussions on how we can think about gray warfare and the return to classic diplomacy, if we can hope for that. We've seen over the last few months movements, for instance, with on one side with the Minsk agreements moving in Crimea to a push from Zelensky to a Crimean platform, which would alternate that to the Normandy format and great powers deciding on Eastern Europe, which is Eastern Europe's worst fear, right? And what we bang on in the United States. And then on the other side, we see formats after Nagorno-Karabakh 2 a few months ago, 6-country formats where the United States and the West overall are being purposefully pushed out. And you have countries like Georgia in the middle saying, whoops, where does that leave us with Iran and Russia and Syria and Turkey surrounding us? So indeed, the United States does need to step in. And when it comes to gray warfare and trying to catch up with technology, we do see a little bit of transnational cooperation, Ukraine, Georgia, Romania, all these like-minded countries, but with their limited resources. So I fear, to finish off in a pessimistic note, that without a real strategy of the United States in terms of both diplomacy and military, we do see the United States increasing in presence, but not necessarily leading in long term to a plan for more Western security and more security for the region.
Thank you.
General Breedlove, I saw you protesting, or
No, not protesting. I just want to, we've had two great answers. I just wanted to add one little bit more before Stephen moves on. Do we have time, Stephen?
Yes, please, go ahead.
So let me again agree with everything said. I'm tracking right here with these conversations. But let me be very blunt. If I was to tell people that I was really trying to change something, what needs to be done, or your question was how to prepare, it would be two very simple things. One, we need to get some policy that applies. And two, we need to grow some intestinal fortitude or strength of character. The bottom line right now, when we talk about policies in NATO and other places about warfare, information warfare, social engineering of the all of the tools that are out there, everything we say is defensive. We got to be more defensive. We got to get better at defense. We got to defend. We got to, no. Why would the enemy change if his cost never increase? We have to work to increase the cost on the enemy so that he sees that there's a cost to these actions he's taking. We need to think offensively. We need to get on the field. How many tennis players go to a world championship and say, I'll receive serve for the whole match? Okay, that's what we're doing. We're receiving serve. So we need to grow some intestinal fortitude, get some strength of character, take the field of battle, involve some offense in the things that we do in the gray zone, and so that the enemy sees cost for his actions or her actions. Sorry, I got up on my soapbox a little bit.
I think that was brilliant. And if I, for 1 second, turn over the moderator role and ask Giselle, I know from her view, she'd move half of the US fleet into the Black Sea. So tell us, what is there to be done?
Well, you know, again, this is, I mean, I agree with General Breedlove 2000%. I mean, to you know, an introduction of even a small but regular American presence there would take these, you know, the kinds of methods that the Russians use and the Turks have started to develop, would eliminate those in very, very rapidly. Okay. You know, those drones cannot survive in a modern air defense context, or you know, they are beneficiaries of air superiority or air supremacy or the lack of enemy, you know, combat air capability. So these things, you know, they're all tied together. The economic, the propaganda, all the political warfare, gray zone stuff is tied into to the hard security questions. And it's so easily within our capability at such a modest cost, not just to react to every little twitch of, you know, or movement of the line in Ukraine or what have you, but to get several steps ahead of the competition. And I still think that would send a signal throughout the region that would make such a huge difference. You know, an American commitment of a small amount of very capable force, and you know, possibly might even change some European minds about being able to invest and whether there, you know, there are better economic prospects in the region and stuff like that. So again, this is just sort of a heartbreaking kind of a situation where the kingdom is being lost for the want of a nail to a certain degree.
Well, General, you've done something important there that I want to draw attention to, and Giselle and Yulia, you've both you know, kind of foot stomped that, and that's the idea whether, and it applies more broadly, not just to this particular question we're talking about and I think there may be a particular inclination in this administration, arguably, to return to traditional diplomacy, to return to, you know, what is old, rather than doing what an exercise like we did in this project is so important to do, which is put ideas on the table that are just different from what we've done in the past, and consider options and choices that are different from what we've done in the past, whether it's how to contend with hybrid warfare or any other issue in the region. And I think that's a really important part of what we're trying to do in this work. So I thank all three of you for jumping on that. I want to ask one other question and then leave some time for some of the questions that are coming in from our audience. And Giselle, let me start maybe with you on this one, and then General and Yulia, either or both of you elaborate or counterpoint if you have something to add. One of the things we saw in a couple of the scenarios we explored here in this work is relations between Turkey and Russia, not only on the mend relative to where they are today, but really quite stronger, much deepened and more intertwined than they are today. If we fast forward a few years into the future and we see that kind of deepening of Turkey and Russia relations, again, what would some of the implications be for some of the security issues we're talking about here, or energy development, infrastructure development, some of the other things that are so important in the Black Sea arena?
Well, if that were to happen, I think let me come back to what the consequence would be if that were to happen. I do think that's sort of unlikely. The Turks, as they so frequently do, are looking for as much strategic independence as they can get. I mean, if they're making nice with the Russians on one hand, they're also slaughtering Russian-backed militias in Idlib the next moment. So it is a transaction. I still think it's a transactional relation. And you also have to wonder how Turkey's going to interact with China as China becomes a greater presence in the region, whether there's, again, sort of going to be another outside power muscling in, and how the Turks will respond to that, whether instead of sort of triangulating between the West and Russia and Iran on the one hand, they'll now be triangulating with a Chinese point of influence as well, which again just sort of brings me back to my first point is I just have a hard time imagining the Turks sort of settling down or making a bet on any one or a pair or combination of the outside powers. And I think maybe it was Yulia who said earlier, their principal strategic imperative has always been to keep others out, even when they're unable to reclaim the, again, neo-Ottoman dream that apparently still motivates them. So, and particularly with Russia. I mean, I think that they'll still be open to transactional relationships. They'll buy stuff, but that helped them get out of the F-35 program, which saved them a lot of money. So, I'm repeating myself, but when the Turks change, I'm sure I'll be stone dead.
Just one note on Turkey. I remain optimistic. I first started serving there in the early 80s and have been there dozens and dozens of times, waiting to fight wars or flying into free fly zones and over the years. And their geostrategic position makes them incredibly important to us. And we need to remember that they are an ally, and we want to keep them an ally. I jokingly but seriously remind that we have been thrown out of a NATO nation once in our history. We're not anywhere near that right now with Turkey. So we have survived pretty tough things in the NATO alliance. And I think that Turkey sees its advantages as a NATO member as well. Having dealt with the delegation there many times as the SACEUR, they are some of the most skilled diplomats in the world and very convincing, and they know how to use organizations like NATO to advance Turkey's position on items. And so I just don't see us at the precipice yet. That's not to say that it couldn't happen, but I just don't see us there.
While we are on Turkey, one of the questions from the audience, and Jonah, maybe you could take this first. It's not quite a counterpoint to what you just described, but it poses to me an interesting question about what the implications for NATO's organizational resilience would be if we look at Turkey's kind of offensive policies in the region, and if they were to continue into the future, what the impact on NATO and the resilience of NATO as a security alliance might be.
Again, I am an optimist. I think I'm jokingly saying NATO has a very Chinese view. It has a long view of keeping alliance together and what the alliance is important about. When France threw us out, look at France now, a vibrant, big part of NATO, and sometimes a bit tough to handle, but an important part of NATO. And I'm looking way down the road, and I see it's very important. Rather than fret over reasons and ways we might want to move them out, let's focus on the ways that keep them in. And I do believe that although they are going through a bit of a change in sea state of the way the government and the people work, that they still share Western values, the things that make us all, that bring us all together. I think in the main, they're still with us. And so I refuse to get on the negative train here. I think we just keep working this.
Fair enough, thanks.
Maybe just one very quick word, as I'm lying somewhere between General Breedlove and Giselle on this, but I want to bring in the Black Sea approach. So Turkey, we can't do security without Turkey because of Montreux. So I think there's two ways of bringing Turkey potentially back in, at least when it comes to Black Sea, when it comes to the Eastern Med. That's a whole entire game, and I don't think we have the capacity to go into that today. But when it comes to the Black Sea, countries like Ukraine, Giselle mentioned the cooperation on the military that takes off in the last few months. Romania with a long-term relationship, Georgia with a long-term relationship, they can push for more west in the Black Sea, 3 countries on the Black Sea, by avoiding kind of circumventing the anti-Americanism that has been fueled by Erdogan over the last few years and does not help when it comes to NATO Black Sea security. And then the other way about it would be to circumvent that. If the Turks do not want outside powers in the Black Sea, reflag the ships. They don't have to be NATO ships. They don't have to be US official ships. You can flag them as regional ships. And there's so many ways, now there's a lot of discussion on the Western front of the Black Sea and how we can think about military mobility, for instance, via the Danube that leads into the Black Sea, and in the long term, some ways of connecting, at least in energy better, the South Caucasus, that side into the Black Sea. And once you have that, even with the Turks' emphasis on national sovereignty, of keeping the Black Sea to their own, these include these other countries as well, not just Russia and China, not just Russia and Turkey. We tend to forget that. With that in mind, there's a way to circumvent that on one side, and on the other side, to find ways to get their buy-in back in once they perceive Russia as potentially more of a security competition than a security cooperation, which is not the case right now, I would argue.
If I could revise and extend my remarks a little bit from before, if I'm not entirely comfortable living with the Turks, I really would not want to live without them. There's no question about that. It's just that I think we have to understand what their security concerns are. They have 270 degrees of security that looks northward, eastward, and southward, and it's pretty messy on all those fronts. So first of all, that reminds us that their western front, so to speak, is by far their most secure front, and they're arguably their best bet and most natural and longest lasting strategic partners. But again, they have uncertainty facing in three directions, and they're trying very hard to increase what they perceive to be their security. And so they're just acting, I don't know that they always act, wisely in their security interests, but I do sort of understand why they behave the way that they do.
And one more two-finger injection here. This will be the only thing I get quoted on because it's controversial. But the fact of the matter is, if the mantra was to fail and the straits were to close, it does not mean that we cannot defend our allies and partners in the Black Sea. We just fought a protracted war far from any ocean. And we have more than once moved Muhammad to the mountain or the mountain to Muhammad to do what we have to do. And so I wouldn't want anybody to get this feeling that because the straits were closed, that we're out of taking care of NATO partners and allies. We could still do that business if we have to. We need our US Navy. They're awesome. And we need their kind of sea control if we find ourselves in an ugly place, and their ability to project power. But if we can't get into the Black Sea, it doesn't mean we're done. It just means we do it a little different way.
Well, I think because all three of you are just that good, you've answered one of the questions from our audience without even knowing it, without my even having posed it, and that had to do with the how important is the free passage of the Bosphorus Straits. I want to ask one of the first questions that came in shortly after we started, and it's kind of a fundamental principles question. When we began this project, Yulia, I learned a great deal from you and the rest of the Frontier Europe team about the Black Sea and the nations of the region, and was cautioned against thinking sort of as necessarily as they are all the same. They're all, one group. So one of the questions from our audience is, why is it important to think of this region and the nations of this region as a group, as an entity? And let me kind of riff on the audience member's question a little bit. What would it look like if we didn't fall into that trap and thought in a much more nuanced way, rather than talking about, capital B, capital S, Black Sea strategy?
Yeah.
Ask you to start, Yulia.
Sure. Thank you, Stephen, and thank you for the question from the audience. It's a great question that I bump into a lot of times, and the way I try to answer that is so far, when we look particularly from the United States perspective into the Black Sea, the way we thought, the way the United States conducts policy in the region is exactly by taking one country at a time, strategic partnerships, frenemy relations, etc., depending on the Black Sea country that we're talking about. And so that hasn't worked too well in terms of creating a regional policy. Now, of course, unlike in other regions, like the Baltic states, where we have much more political willingness to and a common, a shared threat perception, we do not have that in the Black Sea, and that's the major challenge, I guess, of this kind of work. But I would say, based on Stephen's remarks earlier, that we have to think a bit outside the box and think what has not worked so far and how can we make it work. I think in the 21st century, when we're talking, especially in this region and in the greater region, looking at the Caspian Sea as well, and the Eastern Med, that are increasingly becoming, we separate them conceptually in Western minds and not only international minds as regions, but they're actually just one big region where land is too much and sea is not enough, and countries are fighting over resources there. With new power competition from Russia and Turkey, and with the pushback from countries in between, kind of the no man's land that Giselle was referring to a bit earlier. And so despite the challenges of thinking about this region as a region, because from many points of view, indeed, it is not, unlike the Baltic, if you compare it to that, I think this is a way that, or the best way to think about trying to change from strategic bilateral or formats. We think in the Black Sea, another issue is to think in the NATO format. Who is with NATO? Who isn't? And I think even through this discussion that we've so far had today, we've highlighted, all of us, that it's not the case, that NATO membership is not how you divide the world red and blue anymore, the way you did it in 1990, 1991, when Turkey was a NATO member to be able to push against the Soviet Union in the Black Sea. These things have radically changed. And because NATO formats or EU formats are pretty rigid when it comes to membership and non-membership, and we have this complicated political unwillingness or chaos in terms of perceptions, the way to go about it, I think the United States has vast experience in other regions in that, is to think in terms of coalitions of the willing, though that term is so negative at this point, but they don't have to be coalitions of the willing in terms of force, of military deployment. They can be coalitions of the willing when it comes to cyber cooperation, all these aspects of hybrid warfare, from the softest side of the spectrum to the hardest. We need to think in ways for the Black Sea specifically to bring like-minded countries together, to help those that are underdeveloped catch up a little bit, to be able to think, at least in defensive terms, more efficiently against enemies of theirs and of the United States. So I think, long story short, we've done bilateral so far, and it hasn't worked greatly in terms of long-term policy and bringing long-term benefits to the region and stabilizing it, really. So let's try to think in terms of out-of-the-box coalitions of the willing outside of NATO, if it has to be, outside of the EU, if it has to be, like-minded countries. And with that in mind, I think someone was mentioned that earlier, either Giselle or Breedlove, General Breedlove, thinking about bringing in that way through coalitions of the willing countries that are more reluctant, like Turkey, like Bulgaria to a certain extent, to buy in more into regional security.
General or Giselle, anything on that before I wrap us up?
I'll try to be really, simplistic and brief. I mean, I think the Black Sea is like a meeting place for a whole variety of peoples. The sea is the repository for some of the world's greatest and longest rivers that extend in incredibly differing directions. So it's a common meeting place for many peoples, and they share an understanding of that commonality. So I mean, they're both distinct and individual cultures and nations for sure. But they can't live without one another either. And there's a particular opportunity for the United States as an outside power to help stitch together these peoples who share so many interests, and in particular, share a historical fear of Russian power, to both protect their uniqueness, but allow them to be greater than the sum of their parts. And these are also nations and states and cultures that have been suppressed and oppressed and invaded from time immemorial. And they also have an appreciation of how difficult it can be for them to stand alone. So I think sort of taking a bifurcated approach where we are sensitive to the uniqueness of each state and each the individual security and other concerns they have, while also enabling them to more to share what is necessarily a common amongst them in a more secure way, is again remains a great opportunity for the use of American power. And also, I mean, we cannot forget or discount the moral component to this. I mean, to the degree that these still remain peoples who want to be free and live in democratic circumstances, we will undercut our interests and our own ability to act as the world's leading country if we turn a deaf ear or continue to turn a deaf ear to this appeal.
That's terrific. We're just about out of time. That may be a terrific place to wrap us up, unless General or Yulia, you have any final note you'd like to make. Otherwise, I would like to thank all three of you for joining us today. All of you in the audience, thank you all very much for your valuable time. Hope you have found this of interest. And again, our report on these scenarios for the future of the Black Sea region is available on MEI's and Frontier Europe Initiative's website. And we will have more events focused on some of these future issues in the region in the weeks and months to come. So thank you all very much, and have